I'm speaking today with Professor Paul Draper, Professor of Philosophy at Purdue University. Professor Draper works primarily in the fields of philosophy of religion and philosophy of science, a number of other areas as well. He's written extensively on the subject that we're going to be discussing today, which is the meaning and application of the philosophy known as philosophical naturalism. So, Paul, let me begin by asking you if you can give us a very brief definition, if that's possible, of what philosophical naturalism actually is. What is philosophical naturalism?
There are many different versions of philosophical naturalism. The version that I'm particularly interested in, and that I spend a lot of time thinking about, is metaphysical naturalism, which is the view that nature is a closed system, that there are no supernatural entities. There may be non-natural entities, but there are no supernatural ones, which means none that affect nature. By a natural entity, I mean a physical entity or anything a physical entity produces. Those are the natural entities. So if metaphysical naturalism is true, then there is no God, there are no leprechauns, there are no supernatural entities, only natural ones.
Okay, well, that's a very good definition, and you'd probably be the first to say that that's a definition and not the definition, that other philosophers might offer hard or soft definitions or slightly different definitions. Just for historical interest, how far back can we trace the beginnings of what we're now calling scientific naturalism or philosophical naturalism?
Well, again, I agree with you. There's many versions. There's other things besides metaphysical naturalism, and that's included in philosophical naturalism. Metaphysical naturalism you can trace back all the way. I mean, the ancient atomists that were trying to explain the world in terms of just the physical parts of it.
People like Democritus, for example.
Right, like Democritus. So it goes a long ways back.
Okay. Now, would someone who's heard this for the first time be entitled to say, if there are no supernatural entities, we can automatically rule out the existence of God or that there is a God, however we want to formulate it, because God is usually understood to be a supernatural entity, something which exists outside or beyond nature and presumably therefore beyond knowledge or provability. Consequently, a God like that would have no way to influence the natural world. Have I formulated that badly? I probably have, but...
No, that's fine. Yeah, that's right. I mean, God is, as understood in many different religions, is a being that is not a part of nature. I mean, the traditional theistic version of God is a being that created nature, and so can affect it, despite not being a part of nature, and so by definition is a supernatural entity. So if naturalism is true, then there is no such creator God.
Okay, so if you work with the old aphorism, sort of like causes produce like effects, just as a starting point, if there were anything like God, and I'm thinking, for example, of those wonderful formulations that the deists and the early Unitarians came up with in the 18th century, you might come up with some sort of natural process equivalent to God. Is that open to discussion in your view?
Well, some natural process that would be God?
Well, God, in this case, God might end up being a kind of circumlocution for something which has nothing to do with classical theism. But at what point do we eliminate the theistic vocabulary? Because I know that a lot of theologians think that they're working within a kind of naturalistic worldview, but there's always an exception to that. And the exception obviously happens with the salvage attempts that they're obliged to do if they're practicing something called theology and not philosophy.
Well, I think there's, once people give up the idea of supernatural beings, they still have all the leftover religious feelings that they've been brought up to have, and so there's definitely a motivation for trying to find something sacred in nature and identify that with God. I mean, pantheism, for example, right, which says that in some sense, nature, there's a unity to everything in nature, and that unity is divine, right? Is an attempt to what could be compatible with there being no supernatural entities. Now, the big problem for that attempt is the question is, well, what is this unity? And even if there is, because there's different senses of unity. I mean, sure, in one sense, there's a unity, it's all natural or something like that. But, what is exactly the unity, and why would we think it's divine? Why would we think and what does divine mean? Does it mean we're supposed to worship it? If it's just nature, why worship it? So, yeah, I mean, naturalism in the metaphysical sense is compatible with some conceptions of God, but then the question is, what's the evidence for it? If everything comes from physical entities, why should we think that, we know something now because of physics and cosmology about the history of the universe. At what point in the evolution of the universe we say, aha, now we've got something divine here,
Okay.
something worthy to worship. That's the tough, that's going to be the tough part for the people that want to reconcile the two.
So leaps of faith are never modest.
Right.
Only the theologians, I guess, do they acquire modesty.
Yeah.
But I know you've thought a lot about this because you've written on the subject, you discussed it, and I'm sure you've thought even more than you've written about the question of design, which is sort of the rage right now, various permutations of the design argument, and I know that you've written extensively about cosmology. What is the fatal flaw with the intelligent design way of thinking about theism, thinking about God?
Well, I think that you have to look at all the arguments individually, and there is no single fatal flaw. I mean, a lot of people like Richard Dawkins want to say, oh, it all boils down to the same thing. Every design argument is just saying, look at this enormous complexity. It's very improbable, and so we need a God. Yeah. But I think that's a terrible oversimplification of design arguments. I think there's some very sophisticated design arguments that are much more than that argument. So you can't give a single fatal flaw. I do think, however, that there is a sense in which the intelligent design community is caught between a rock and a hard place right now, because I think the only way to do a good design argument is you've got to show that not just that something's very improbable because of how complex it is, but you've got to show that there's something about it that makes it likely, say, if God exists, and very unlikely because of its improbability if naturalism is true, let's say. But in order to do that, you need a hypothesis that is specific enough so that it generates probabilities of the data. It makes the data likely. And in order to do that, you've got to say something you've got to build in something, for example, about the moral attributes of God. So here's the way in which I think the intelligent design community is caught between a rock and a hard place. They want to be able to say that there's this good inductive evidence for God's existence based on design, but they don't want to be accused of doing religion, because the intelligent design people want to say, no, we're doing this. This is religion, something separate. This is good science, right? So they don't want to give a specific hypothesis, so they end up with something vague like there is an intelligent designer. But if you think about it, unless you know something about the motives of that designer, right, what it cares about, it doesn't make any predictions at all. Until you know the motives of someone, you can't say they'd be likely to produce this. Why would they be likely to produce this if all you say it's a designer? It's not. You can't go by human motives, because presumably it's not a human that designed.
The divine mind is hard to read.
So if they leave it vague like that, it has no predictive power whatsoever. If they make it more specific, they'll be accused of smuggling in religion. So I can't say I feel terribly sorry for them.
That's rather intriguing. I hadn't thought of that. So in other words, for the design argument to work, you'd have to know what God was trying to do to see if he did it well. And then, of course, without seeing the blueprints, you really can't tell whether the building was built in the appropriate way, using the right materials so that it would sort of withstand the hurricane that happened. And that seems to me to get into something else, which I know that you've thought pretty deeply about, and that is the question of natural and moral evil and how that weighs in on theistic arguments of various kinds. And I know that you've written pretty extensively on someone, I believe, correct me if I'm wrong, accused of trivializing this in his overall theology, and that's Richard Swinburne. Swinburne's idea is that we don't have to have the best of all possible worlds because we can't really imagine that world, but we can imagine a world, which I think I'm using his language properly, is good enough for the reasons for which it was created.
Right.
Now, when I first read that, I thought, gosh, there's something wrong here. But I'm not sure I've quite figured out what's wrong with that. I mean, it's more appealing than the idea of a perfect world, because the weight of natural and moral evil in that world is substantial, I would think. And if you're worried about the quantification of evil, then there just seems to be so much. I mean, everything from cancer to the latest hurricane that hits Cuba, which would weigh against the theistic argument. And yet if we're talking about a world which is just good enough, it seems to change the terms of the argument slightly. What would you say about that?
Yeah, I actually agree with the idea that theists are not committed to saying that God creates the best possible world. I don't think God's obligated to create the best. I mean, presumably there's much better beings than human beings that could exist, possibly. Is God obligated to make those beings instead of us? No, I don't think so. I don't see why. He doesn't violate any obligations to those superior beings because they don't exist, and we can hardly complain. Assuming we're happy to exist. So I don't think that. I agree with Swinburne that God's not obligated to make the best, but but that doesn't mean, of course, that this world that we're in is the sort of world you would expect God to make, even as being minimally good enough. I mean, looking at it from the intelligent design standpoint again.
It's the rock and the hard place again.
A little bit different. I mean, there's intelligent design people always want to say, well, there's a teleological ordering to nature. Things are goal directed, right? And all the parts work together to achieve that goal. Now, suppose that this universe, let's assume for the sake that this universe was created by God, and then you probably would say, yeah, so there is a kind of teleology in nature. But then what is part of that teleology? Part of that teleology is that like human beings and animals are designed in a way that various things work together to try and promote their flourishing. And yet, so few animals flourish, and so few human beings flourish. Because, again, the way things work on a naturalistic perspective, you explain the lack of flourishing in this way. Well, there's something that needs to drive evolution. It's natural selection, in particular survival selection. So for that to work, you need overpopulation, and then you need competition for survival. And so inevitably, a lot of animals and human beings are never going to flourish. They're going to die young, or there's got to be some that will barely survive, and so they'll languish for much of their lives. So from a naturalistic perspective, you can explain this. From a theistic perspective, it's really puzzling, because even with evolution, the fact of evolution of common ancestry, common descent, there's still a question of if God exists, there's all sorts of ways besides natural selection that he could drive evolution.
Right.
And so if we're to think of this in this teleological way, there's a sense in which a caring, loving God would want all these beings to achieve their end, to achieve their goal, to flourish, and yet so few do flourish. So it's much better predicted by naturalism, these facts about flourishing and languishing, than it is by theism.
You use the word, and I'm quite comfortable with it, teleology. Does teleology have a role within the naturalistic worldview? Can we talk about teleology, or has the cosmology or the understanding of the world that naturalism gives us, has it basically ruled that perspective out, at least in terms of the development of the universe, or even the development of natural law?
I think in naturalistic perspective, most likely there is no cosmic teleology. There is no, and then even within the biological world, the apparent teleology is explained through non-teleological principles, through Darwinian evolution, and so on. So the teleology that still exists, though, is at least there's still human beings, and some animals have goals,
Right.
and that's genuine teleology, and that creates purposes and explains why there's value in the world. You know, there's still animals and human beings with preferences that can be satisfied or not. So you get teleology at that level, which allows you to make sense of there being better or worse, good and bad, and so on.
Let me change gears ever so slightly here to talk about something that is of interest, I think, to all of us. We lost the philosopher Richard Rorty fairly recently, and I guess the best way to think about Rorty is that he went through certain philosophical phases, but he was often labeled at the end a postmodernist, and I know that there is not exactly a quarrel. There are certainly some differences between postmodernism as a school of thought generally, whether we're talking about architecture or literature or philosophy, and the naturalistic worldview.
Right.
What would I'm not going to ask you about a thoroughgoing naturalistic perspective, but what would a naturalistic philosopher have to say about postmodernism as a worldview?
Well, I think that there are two major worldviews that are realist, and that's theism and naturalism. Okay. And then there's a variety of versions of anti-realism, including what's called postmodernism. And so I think that you can divide it into those three categories if you want, and then naturalists and theists come down on the realist side. That there is a world independent of human beings and their thoughts, or any other beings and their thoughts, and furthermore that we can know about that world. And then the puzzle for theists is the theists say, well, how do we know about it? Well, God makes sure, God wants us to know about it because He's good. Naturalists, it's a little bit harder. How do we know about this world independent of us, right? And then maybe you can give some kind of evolutionary story that cognitive faculties that produce true beliefs are more likely to have survival value. That's tougher for the naturalist. And then, of course, the anti-realist says, no, it's just we can't we can't know it. We could never know about a mind-independent world, and so we should be anti-realist. But then, naturalists and theists, I think, feel like we just threw the baby out with the bathwater.
Okay, I understand. And of course, some people think that that postmodernists regard everything from the world to a religion, sacred scripture, as a negotiable thing. I mean, everything is text, everything is narrative,
right,
and therefore everything is interpretation. But it isn't just the lack of hard facts. I mean, for example, wouldn't there be a consistent objection among naturalists to the way postmodernists would think about ethics, for example? I mean, is that something that we need to worry about?
Would there be a consistent objection from naturalists to the way postmodernists think about ethics?
About behavior, if you prefer. I mean, isn't human behavior a narrative too? I mean, it becomes part of your biography. So I'm not quite sure where you would sort of locate moral choice within that system. Would that be the naturalist spin? Yeah.
Yeah. Well, of course, naturalists have gone a lot of directions with ethics, right? So because they have trouble sometimes making sense of it say with objective moral truths or objective values. And so and sometimes I think the way they move towards various versions of relativism, it sounds more like postmodernism. Whereas, what I would try and do as if I were a naturalist would be to make sense of a kind of objective morality within the naturalistic worldview. If I could do that right now, I'd do it for you, but
normative ethics is possible.
There yet.
Normative ethics is possible.
I think so. I hope so on naturalism, but I think sometimes I think that there's something missing in all of these worldviews. We haven't quite got everything yet.
Yeah.
There's got to, because when we get to issues of value and also even things having to do with mind in general, subjective experience, it seems like, well, we don't have all the pieces to the puzzle yet, and then maybe we'll see whether it'll be a new version of naturalism or something entirely different.
You're anticipating my final question, which is really about the future of naturalism. I mean, from what you just said, it sounds as though we may not be at the end of the line yet, that there may be something beyond naturalism, or some something in the future which is not quite the naturalism, or naturalism is the way we think about it now. Is that?
Well, I'm a skeptic about these worldviews. I'm not a theist and I'm not a naturalist. So the future of naturalism is iffy, according to me. You know, I think it may become less iffy in the future if good naturalistic explanations of things like mind and free will are developed. If it goes a different direction, then maybe, again, maybe there'll be some alternative that we haven't even formulated yet that will be the winner in the long run. So I'm a good philosopher. I'm waiting for the conclusive arguments to come in before I'm willing to commit.
A good philosopher, a good skeptic. Thank you.
Good skeptic. Well, I think a good philosopher is very skeptical.
Yeah. Thanks, Paul. Thanks very much.
Thanks a lot.